This is an extremely tall and handsome guy wearing a suit, minus the shorts, just ignore the shorts. But he owns that suit. And if you also own a suit in the year 1890, you might be able to trade for Hall of Fame pitcher Cy Young. And if you think that's a crazy trade, well, it is. But I'm going to tell you 10 of the weirdest things baseball players have been traded for, all the way from fences to food. And the last one is absolutely crazy. Starting off, we got Johnny Binky Jones traded for a live turkey. What? It's the year 1930, and Joe Engel is the president of the Chattanooga Lookouts, a minor league baseball team. Besides the team being one of the worst teams in the league, he did a lot to try and get fans to come to games. He gave away houses and cars. He staged elephant hunts in the stadium with hunters in costumes. There was ostrich races, and he even had some announcers announce the game on Camelback. And he also hosted a recreational game between the Lookouts and the Yankees team with Babe Ruth on it. In that year, 1930, Johnny Binky Jones was the shortstop for the Lookouts. Years before, he played one season in the MLB with the Brooklyn Dodgers, but in the year 1930, he was not doing so well in the minor leagues. The stats are kind of hard to find, but this is kind of what we're working with. And the press heavily criticized Johnny Jones and the team. So Joe Engel, the president, traded Johnny Jones to the Charlotte Hornets. Not those Charlotte Hornets, a minor league baseball team back in the day. But he straight up traded him for a 25-pound live turkey. The reason was because he claimed the turkey was having a better year. Eventually at the stadium, there was a baseball writers meeting there, and when the writers arrived, they saw a turkey on the table. And there's a little sign on it that read, "Through the courtesy of Johnny Jones." And Joe Engel ended up serving the turkey to the writers, who were critical of the team. And the writers actually ate the turkey. And Engel said, "You've been giving me the bird, so now have one on me." Johnny Jones decided not to take a picture with his trading partner, the turkey, but the Hornets president did take a picture with the turkey. Unfortunately, they did not win the trade because the turkey ended up being chewy, and Jones' career ended that season. Next, we got an entire baseball team getting traded for another entire baseball team. The year was 1957. The Brooklyn Dodgers were about to move to LA, and the Cubs were coming off a season where they just finished last place in the National League, and they wanted to change things up. So both teams traded their entire 25-man minor league baseball roster for the other, which I would assume would be absolutely crazy at the time. Just imagine how crazy it would be today if this happened. It would probably be the top news for weeks, and it's technically still possible for it to happen now, but I think that would never happen today. Next up, we got John McDonald getting traded for himself. John McDonald. Now, MLB players can be traded for a player to be named later. Usually the player is not very a notable player, but there are exceptions like Trey Turner and David Ortiz. But in July 2005, Blue Jays infielder John McDonald got traded to the Detroit Tigers for a player to be named later. And in November 2005, Detroit decided that player to be named later was going to be John McDonald. So John McDonald went from Toronto to Detroit for himself, so he went all the way back. Now, even though this was basically a free trade besides having to pay for his salary, this didn't really have much of a huge impact on any of the teams, but McDonald did stay with the Blue Jays for another 5.5 seasons. And there's only ever 4 times in the MLB where this happened before, which is kind of a lot, but Alright, now it's time for me to explain what happened when Cy Young got traded for a suit. So it's the year 1890. The Cleveland Spiders were looking for some pitching, and they had some interest in a tri-state league pitcher pitching in Canton, Ohio, and he went by the name of Cy Young. The cost of getting him was $300 and a new suit for the Canton manager, so the transaction went through, and Cy Young ended up having a Hall of Fame career, and he ended up being one of the greatest pitchers of all time, as he had a 2.63 ERA in over 7,000 innings pitched, so they would definitely regret that one. Next up, we got Charley Pride getting traded for a bus. Former music star and Grammy Award winner Charley Pride used to play baseball. In 1953, Charlie wasn't that great at throwing a baseball, but he was still playing baseball for the Yankees minor league team, but he got injured, and then he returned, and he got lit up in his start. So he's sent back to Memphis, where he played for his old baseball team, the Memphis Red Sox, who were in the Negro League. And before the 1954 season, he was ready to rejoin the Red Sox, but then he wanted to go to Louisville with his teammate Goose Curry, who was also on the Red Sox, but he was looking to be the coach for the Louisville Clippers, which was in Alabama, and Charlie was willing to go with him. But Memphis couldn't afford a team bus, so Charlie Pride and Jesse Mitchell, another player, got traded to Alabama to the Birmingham Black Barons for enough money to buy a bus. Apparently Charlie sang during a lot of road trips when people were trying to sleep, and years later he got cut from the team, but his old GM hooked him up in a job in Montana, where he ended up starting his famous music career. Now my friend Nicholas, he knows quite a bit more about music than I do, so I'm gonna call him and see just how good Charlie Pride was at music.
Moo. Oh, little Nicholas.
Is that 100% cow?
That is. I got a very serious question for you. Have you heard of Charlie Pride?
Yes.
Was he good at music?
Yes.
Wow.
Next up, we got Cliff Dapper getting traded for an announcer. The year's 1942. Cliff Dapper was a young, promising player at just age 22. He was on the Brooklyn Dodgers, who were a great team, but they still had some better players who they could play instead of him. So he ended up sitting on the bench a lot, and in 1943 to 1945, he missed out on baseball because of being in World War II. In 1946, he returned to baseball, playing a couple seasons in the minor leagues, and before the 1949 season, the Dodgers needed a new announcer because their current one was sick. In Atlanta, there was an announcer named Ernie Harwell who was announcing for the Atlanta Crackers, who were a minor league team there, and the Dodgers had some interest in him. So the Dodgers decided to trade Cliff Dapper for an announcer, Ernie Harwell, which did violate the broadcasting contract, but the trade went through. And this was the only ever player to get traded for an announcer. Ernie Harwell announced for the Dodgers for 2 seasons, but after that he went on to have a very long 55-year broadcasting career, announcing for multiple teams, and I think he announced for the Tigers for like over 30 years. Next we got Len Dondero getting traded for dog nuts? Nope, donuts. Now there are some different rumors going around with this story, but this actually seems to be the thing that happened. In 1930, the minor league team, the San Antonio Indians, had a second base named Len Dondero. I think that's how you pronounce it. I hope. And he was doing well. Meanwhile, the Dallas Steers, another team in the league, they also had some interest in Dondero. And they also happened to own a bakery. So the Dallas owners offered the San Antonio owners a dozen donuts in exchange for Leo Dondero. And the two owners ended up meeting and eating the donuts together. But they decided not to do the trade. So kind of seems like they got some free donuts. I don't know. Next, we got Lefty Grove getting traded for a fence. Future Hall of Famer Lefty Grove was pitching in the minors in 1920 for the Martinsburg Mountaineers. And their outfield fence happened to get destroyed by a storm, and they didn't have the money to replace it. So after Grove only pitched 6 games that season, he got traded to the Baltimore Orioles, not the MLB team, Baltimore Orioles, but a minor league team, and he was traded for $3,500, the exact amount of money it cost to get a new outfield fence. And 5 years later, Lefty Grove got sold for over $100,000 to the Philadelphia Athletics in the MLB, and he had a Hall of Fame career. So they kind of messed up on that trade, but they got a new fence. Next, we got Dave Winfield. Winniefield. We're gonna go Winniefield. He got traded for dinner. In 1994, the MLB players went on strike in mid-August, but they're still able to play some games. 42-year-old Dave Winfield was a future Hall of Famer, and he was on the Minnesota Twins, who were a below 500 team. He was near the end of his career and in the last year of his contract, and the Minnesota Twins GM, McPhail, wanted to put Winfield on a winning team. And Cleveland was looking good, and they were looking to go on a playoff run. And Minnesota and Cleveland's GMs happened to be friends. They played tennis and ate out together, and Cleveland had some interest in the veteran. So Winfield got traded to Cleveland for a player to be named later, but that happened just before the strike canceled the rest of the games for the season. So Cleveland never sent back a player. Instead, the Cleveland executive took out the Twins executives to have a nice meal. Some say it might be steak, some say it might be pizza. Either way, kind of seemed like a ripoff. Next, we got Ken Krahenbull. We're gonna go with that. Next, we got Ken Krahenbull getting traded for a catfish. I'm just gonna call him Ken. Ken was once a big league potential phenom, but he had injuries and got released by the Cubs in 1993. So he was playing a couple seasons in independent league ball for a few different teams. But in 1998, he wanted to go back to his old team, the Greenville Bluesmen, since he wasn't sure how much longer he'd be playing, and Greenville seemed to have a pretty good shot at winning a championship. Even though he wanted a trade, no trade ended up happening. So he decided to take control of the situation himself. So he drove 25 hours straight from California to Greenville, Mississippi, only stopping for gas, and he drove over 1,800 miles. While he was driving, both teams started to realize what was happening, so they quickly scrambled to make a deal. So they decided to trade Ken for $1,000 and 2 players. And to sweeten the deal, Greenville's general manager added 10 pounds of catfish to the trade to get some publicity. But Ken was still driving and he didn't know the trade happened yet, until he pulled up and he heard about the trade. And initially, he was mad that he got traded for a catfish. On top of that, after no sleep and driving 25 hours straight, he was told that he was going to be pitching that night. And they were playing against the 2-time reigning champion. On top of that, it was a cold and rainy night. It looked like it was going to be a rough game, but still, Ken was determined to prove his old team wrong, that he was more valuable than a catfish. There's only about 80 people at the game, and Ken pitched for the first inning. He allowed no hits and no walks. Second inning, no hits or walks. Third inning, he allowed no hits or walks. And the umpire said, "We're just going to keep playing until you give up a hit." But Ken kept it up, and he ended up pitching a perfect game, winning the game 1-0. And after, the fans rushed onto the field surrounding Ken to celebrate. And the story of Ken getting traded for a catfish and also his performance made headlines nationally. And Ken was able to get interviewed on radio stations worldwide. And Good Morning America even went down to Greenville to visit. And Ken was given the nickname Catfish Ken. And one article even claimed that this was getting more publicity than the Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa home run race. His old team who just traded him, the Pacific Suns, they even held a catfish night in his honor, and Greenville provided 1,000 pounds of delicacies and a chef to prepare it for the game. And apparently it was really good. Ken was no longer angry about the trade, and a local farm even invited him to come over after his first game to pick out a fish, since Greenville, Mississippi is pretty well known for catfish farms. Now, if you ask me, this is pretty smart marketing for the team who decided to trade a catfish for him. But the craziest part is, Ken doesn't even like catfish. Real quick, you see this number right here on the screen? Yeah, for every subscriber I'll get, I'll do that many push-ups. So you should subscribe, and hopefully you'll get like 10K by the end of the year. Next, we got John Martina getting traded for oysters. At one point, Martina had the world record for the farthest ever baseball thrown. In the year 1909, he entered a competition to see who could throw the farthest baseball. He paid 50 cents to enter, and the previous world record was 400 feet. Martina picked up the ball and threw it 417 feet, breaking the world record, and he ended up making 25 bucks off it. The next year, he joined his first professional baseball team in 1910, the Savannah Indians, who were a minor league baseball team. He did well and was in the minors for a couple of seasons, and he ended up being one of the best baseball players in the Southern Association. In the year 1923, he did so well that the next year in 1924, the Washington Senators, an MLB team, decided to sign him, or trade for him, pick him up somehow. And they ended up winning the World Series. After that, he went back to the minor leagues and was near the end of his career. Entering the offseason in 1929, playing for the Dallas Steers, Martina wanted to get released, and he was negotiating to try and get released. His proposal was if he got released, he would give them 2 barrels of oysters. Since his dad was an oyster dealer and his nickname growing up, and I think even at the time, was Oyster Joe. The team agreed, so Joe was part of a transaction for 2 oyster barrels. Now, that technically was a release and not really a trade, but this next one is actually a trade, as we got Mike Cisco getting traded for nothing. It was 2013 spring training. Mike Cisco was coming off an excellent season in the bullpen for the Philadelphia Phillies AA and AAA teams, but he was now 26, and he wasn't going to make the Phillies MLB team. But the Los Angeles Angels had some interest, so they traded him for nothing. Yeah. Absolutely nothing. Not cash considerations, not a player to be named later. He got traded for nothing. Supposedly, Philadelphia was just willing to trade him for nothing as a nice gesture, but that doesn't really ever happen in sports. But the trade didn't end up having really a big effect, as that was Mike Cisco's last season, and he had a 3.99 ERA in AA. And for the final trade, this is by far the craziest, doesn't even make sense, and it wasn't even between 2 teams, this was between 2 players. So things started off normal in 1972. The Yankees had 2 pitchers named Fritz Peterson and Mike Kekich. The 2 were once roommates and even good friends. They hung out a lot and even went on double dates together with their wives. In 1972, Peterson and Kekich and their wives went to a party at a sports writer's house. They go in and it sounds like they had a good time, and afterwards they decide to go to a diner, but they decide to switch things up and drive each other's wives. But Mike Kekich and Fritz Peterson's wife, Marlene, arrived to the diner 2.5 hours late. So I don't know if Fritz Peterson and Mike Kekich's wife, Suzanne, were just waiting at the diner for them for 2.5 hours or what happened. But eventually, both the couple started to fall in love with the other spouse. Months later, in December 1972, they decided to make a trade. In the trade, Mike Kekich would receive Fritz Peterson's wife, kids, dog, and house. And Fritz Peterson would receive Mike Kekich's wife, kids, dog, and house. A lot of the article said that the players traded wives, but it seems like Mike Kekich and Fritz Peterson were the ones being traded since they were the ones who switched to a new house. But they both said, we didn't trade wives, we traded lives. Kind of rhymes. From what I found, both of them had a 2- and a 5-year-old at the time the trade happened, which would have been pretty confusing for them, as I'm even confused now. But before the 1973 season in March, they both decided to hold separate press conferences to talk about the trade. Susan Kekich said, it just sort of happened, but everyone is really happy though. And the Yankees general manager, Lee McPhail, said, we might have to call off family day. And Fritz and his new wife, Suzanne, lasted the rest of their lives. But Mike and his new wife, Marlene, they ended up getting separated pretty quickly after just a few months. Mike Kekich regretted the trade and he wanted his old wife and old family back. But it was too late, and apparently Mike Kekich even wanted to kill Fritz Peterson. Years later, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck were interested in making a movie about this situation, but Mike did not want that to happen. But the first season after the trade in 1973, Mike ended up getting traded to Cleveland. He did eventually get remarried, but the two were never teammates ever again. But if you want to see some of the craziest trades that almost happened, click this. Hot take. Oatmeal raisin cookies are kind of fire.